Hello, everyone, and welcome back from the break. This is session 1C in our Facilitating Access track, providing intensive outreach and engagement. Again, my name is Kristen King, and I'll be your producer for this session, and I'm going to run through the housekeeping before we begin. This event is being recorded. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And with that, I'm going to open up the line for our moderator, Sherry Downing. You met Sherry yesterday, and she's going to take it away and bring us into our session. Sherry?
Thanks, Kristen. Welcome back, everyone. I am delighted that you're here on the second day of our Way Home virtual summit on homelessness, serious mental illness, and substance use disorders. You are in track 1, facilitating access, and today our topic will be providing intensive outreach and engagement. Anyone who has done this work knows that this can be a really difficult task to outreach to and engage with people who are experiencing problems, including homelessness, serious mental illness, substance use disorders, multimodal disorders. So welcome. That we have brought 2 speakers that I think you'll find enormously fascinating. Both of them are well qualified to speak to us on this topic. Emmy Titterington, PhD, LMSW, is with the Rutgers School of Social Work in New Jersey. Dr. Titterington is a licensed social worker with extensive direct practice experience working in housing and case management services for people with SMI, or serious mental illness. Her research focuses on the implementation and effectiveness of supportive housing and other forms of homeless services as a means to end homelessness and improve outcomes for people who receive the services. Specifically, she has examined the individual, organizational, and macro systems barriers to street-level policy implementation of person-centered care, harm reduction, and management of risk and recovery in supportive housing. Her work also explores the mechanisms and processes by which adults experiencing homelessness achieve recovery from substance abuse and serious mental illness. She's a recipient of the Robert Moore Award for Excellence in Scholarship from New York University, a New Investigator Award from NIMH, and an Outstanding Doctoral Dissertation of the Year honorable mention from the Society for Social Work and Research, as well as a Ruth Kirstein National Research Service Award Individual Pre-Doctoral Fellowship from NIMH. Now that is a mouthful, but what I think you'll learn from Dr. Titterington is she really has a fresh perspective on some of these topics. We also are bringing back Amanda Buccina, RN, who was with us during the plenary session. Amanda has provided home-based palliative care, and she has been known as the street nurse of Sacramento, California. She worked for the street nurse program in Sacramento from its inception in 2016 until 2018, and in that capacity she provided on-demand care for 200 people experiencing homelessness in Sacramento. She served as a trusted source for on-the-street medical care, advice, and education of a very fragile population. She took her education at the University of California, Davis Medical Center, and I am so excited to hear from Amanda. She's got a great perspective that really looks at outreach and engagement as a relationship, as an important relationship in transcending homelessness. So that's our agenda for today. We'll have Dr. Titterington, and we will have Amanda Buccina, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So keep your questions coming in the All Questions box, and then we'll close. The objectives. We really hope that at the end of this session you will understand some of the differences and subtleties of outreach and engagement practices. maybe gain a few new ideas for improving your practices through respectful engagement, and be able to discuss boundaries, barriers, and professional demeanor while practicing outreach and engagement. So while it's so important to build relationships and expose some of yourself to your clients, we also need to be very aware of boundaries and barriers and professional demeanor. So I'm excited about that part of the presentation. Type in the chat box right now. Just take a moment and tell us, where are you from, and what is one thing that you would like to take away from this session? What would make this session valuable to you? So if you take a moment and just do some additions to the public chat, that would be fabulous. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Titterington. Emmy, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sherry, for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be with you all today and co-presenting with Amanda. I think this is going to be great. We'll have some good conversation around this issue. So I'm going to be talking about best practices, principles, and theory behind the practice of outreach and engagement. I think this should set the stage for Amanda to then go into some great case examples and talk through these concepts in a little bit more detail. So before we really dig into what good outreach and engagement looks like, I think we need to have some common definition of what good outreach and engagement is. In the scientific literature, there really isn't a common agreement on what outreach is. So maybe that's because there are so many different ways to do outreach, or because outreach refers to a practice that can be used with so many different populations, whether it's with individuals who experience homelessness and mental illness or substance use like we're talking about today, or with other groups like gang-involved youth or sex workers. Outreach can generally be thought of as a process designed to contact individuals in non-traditional settings who might otherwise be ignored or underserved. The purpose of this approach is, for the population we're focused on today, is to improve physical and mental health and social functioning, increase use of human services, and reintegrate people into the community. Engagement is another arguably nebulous concept. So engaging with someone in this work can mean getting them into care or building a trusting relationship. If you've ever been asked how you do the work of engagement, it can be pretty hard to boil this process down into concrete terms. It's probably unlikely that your answer would be, first I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this. Because engagement is such an individualized process that is unique to the dynamics between the two people involved, it can be pretty hard to define. But for the purposes of today, we're going to define outreach as the overall process of contacting people wherever they are, and we will define engagement as the process of establishing rapport and forming a trusting relationship that provides the context for assessing needs, defining service goals, agreeing on a plan, and linking people with services. So how do you do outreach and engagement? What does this practice look like? So outreach and engagement, it's a critical component of homelessness service delivery. Many COCs have recognized just how critical this component is and are integrating robust outreach, in-reach, and engagement efforts into their service portfolios. COCs are doing this because outreach engagement is effective in supporting access to stable housing and reducing medical and mental health symptoms. For example, there's a study of about 250 people experiencing homelessness and substance abuse who had contact with a mobile medical outreach clinic in New York City, and all study subjects, regardless of medical condition at baseline, reported reductions in use of crack cocaine, days homeless, and number of health complaints at the 4-month follow-up. So good outcomes for this approach. But what are outreach workers doing that make these programs so effective? So they are, oops, let me go back to that, meeting people where they're at, figuratively and literally. So you're meeting people where they are figuratively in terms of readiness to change, and you are literally meeting people where they're at
in order to make connections with them. So you need to know where they are and how they feel most comfortable being engaged in these settings, whether it's in traditional outreach locations like on the street, in encampments, at drop-in centers, soup kitchens, or in non-traditional locales like the online space. So, for example, in order to reach youth experiencing homelessness, I know it's somewhat of a cliche, but using social media can be a particularly effective strategy for engaging this population. So you're meeting someone where they're at, both figuratively and literally, even if it means meeting up with them in the virtual world. And when you're meeting up with people, you're building a relationship, you're building trust, you're helping to figure out what people need, and you're helping them get those needs met. So in order to be successful in this approach, it's important to appreciate small victories. When you're doing outreach, this might mean just appreciating the fact that someone remembered your name or that they looked at you and acknowledged your presence when you were speaking with them. By appreciating these small victories, you're creating that holding environment that someone needs in order to progress and make change in their lives at their own pace. You're honoring their timeline for change, and ultimately, by cherishing these little pieces of progress, you will reduce the risk of burning yourself out over time. By managing your expectations for the people you're working with, you're being realistic about what can be expected of someone, and it takes the pressure off of you to make big changes for people. Because life is about those small victories. It's rare that any of us make huge leaps of progress. So by celebrating those little bits of progress when people do move forward, it makes the work a lot more fun and doable. Effective outreach workers are also keeping hope alive. So hope is a huge part of recovery from mental illness and substance abuse. First-person narratives of people in recovery often speak about hope as a key pillar of success in recovery. So when someone doesn't give up on you, when they keep showing up day after day, even when you're at your worst, just by showing up, being reliable, and being there for someone through thick and thin can inspire change and build trust and engagement over time. When I was working as an intensive case manager with people who'd been discharged from the state or county psychiatric hospital here in New Jersey, I worked with a woman who, over the course of a few years, managed to burn every bridge and get kicked out of every shelter and every rooming house that I'd ever managed to get her into. And every time I got a lead and we worked some magic to get her in somewhere or to get someone to take her back in where she'd been kicked out, she would somehow manage to get kicked out again, and we'd be back to square one. But I did not give up on her. I kept getting creative, working to find new spots for her to go, even when she was super manic and threw a hostess snowball at me in the street one day. I still showed up the next day to take her to her appointment. That was because I was hopeful that at some point, maybe not on that day in particular or the day after that, maybe 20 years from then, she could eventually get free from her addiction and stay in housing longer than a week or two. I was only able to keep that hope alive because I recognized that just by being able to get her one night in housing was potentially better than her having 0 nights in housing. Obviously, she deserved all nights in housing, but that was a small but important victory toward helping her get into permanent housing once a spot opened up down the road. Outreach and engagement is a continuous process because recovery from mental illness and substance use, from trauma, from many of the issues that people are dealing with is often cyclical, so life is never static for anyone, so we should expect change, expect the possibility of relapse, bad decisions, relationship endings. These are all part of the process of life. So to approach this work realistically, you do have to be able to ride that roller coaster and treat the work as a continuous process, and that might sound counter to what I just said about keeping hope alive, but I think you can keep hope alive and simultaneously be open to that process of change. Those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Effective outreach and engagement usually also employs a team approach because this work is hard, because people usually have a variety of needs that one person alone cannot meet. So having a multidisciplinary team is even better. Using a team-based approach also helps to mitigate loss when a staff member turns over, so the service recipient isn't thrown into the lurch and meeting a brand new person for the first time, starting that engagement process all over again. So it helps with continuity of care, and with the individualization of care by using workers with different professional backgrounds, and it helps prevent worker burnout as well as recipient burnout, because sometimes people just need a break from each other. So how and why do these strategies work in outreach and engagement? What can theory tell us about these practices? So this is a theoretical model developed by Chen and Ogden that describes the process of engagement and development of a working relationship between people with serious mental illness who experience homelessness and frontline providers of critical time intervention, or CTI. CTI, for those who aren't familiar, is an intervention aimed at strengthening people's long-term ties to the community during transitions from institutional settings to community living. And the goals of CTI, as you can see in the box at the top, are client independence and stable housing with adequate support. There are 3 primary foci of frontline practice in the work of CTI, and they are removing barriers to housing stability, helping people adjust to the community living, and developing community support. So workers in this qualitative study said that while clients' initial motivations for obtaining and retaining housing varied at first contact, the working relationship is the essential vehicle to enhance clients' motivation and to develop the agreement between clients' goals and program goals. So the purpose of forming a working relationship, according to these providers, is to develop trust, which not only helps clients who have a desire to obtain housing further their capacity to obtain housing, but it also motivates clients with no initial interest in housing to consider and work for stable housing. And this relationship also keeps clients motivated during difficult times. So the theory is that by building a working relationship, you're developing that trust, which can then enhance clients' motivations for housing and ultimately achieve the goals of the program, which is that client independence, stable housing with adequate support, and these are the goals that most outreach and engagement efforts have for the population that we're talking about today. So according to providers in this study, an effective working relationship has both non-authoritative and humanistic features. So humanistic features mean that relationship is characterized by authenticity, empathy, genuineness, and holding the client in unconditional positive regard. A non-authoritative approach is showing respect for client autonomy instead of imposing guidance. And to further this humanistic, non-authoritative relationship, workers emphasize the importance of 2 practice approaches. One is relating to clients in informal ways, and the other is following client leads. So workers related to clients in informal ways by engaging in casual, flexible encounters, such as chatting, escorting clients to appointments, taking them out for informal activities like going out for coffee. I'm sure this rings a bell for many of you that have done this work before. It wasn't all about sitting down and doing formal assessment and treatment planning all the time. That can turn people off and disrupt engagement. And they visited clients at flexible hours, like doing home visits in the evenings if a client worked during the day. So it wasn't all about using a rigid appointment-based system where a person has a set weekly appointment time. That's that, kind of like a clinic-based approach. They kept interactions more informal as a way to build that working relationship. They also followed clients' leads to show their respect for client autonomy and to convey the message that the client was in control. So for example, workers would follow client leads in conversations instead of pushing topics that clients weren't ready to discuss. They had clients take the lead on identifying the objectives of their work together and in general followed the client's pace in developing that relationship and working toward the goal of obtaining housing. So again, this theory of effective engagement echoes what I mentioned earlier, that meeting people where they're at, both figuratively and literally, builds trust and makes the practice of outreach engagement more effective in the long run. So how do we support these practices at the organizational level? So organizations can provide training and technical assistance on teamwork, boundaries and ethics, and cultural competence. So teamwork does not come naturally to everyone, and not all team dynamics are great from the outset, as I'm sure many of you know. Sometimes team members need support to be good team members. So providing good supervision from the top down, doing team building activities can really help be helpful strategies for improving outreach and engagement efforts. Supervision should also include explicit discussions of boundaries and ethics. We shouldn't assume that everyone gets what appropriate boundaries and ethics are in every circumstance. This work is complicated. You never know what you're going to come across. So workers may need booster sessions on ethics and boundaries and really explicit support around this in supervision. And the same goes for cultural competence. Cultural competence is an essential part of effective engagement and outreach with marginalized groups. If you're unable to engage with a person in a culturally competent way, chances are you are probably going to have a very hard time engaging with them, period. So it's going to make it pretty difficult to develop that trust and build that working relationship. So training and supervision on this is a critical piece of support for outreach and engagement workers. Another strategy to improve outreach and engagement efforts is hiring and supporting people with the lived experience to do this work. So many programs are integrating peer providers with the lived experience of homelessness, mental illness, or substance use on these teams because they recognize that having someone who knows what they're talking about can be really useful when trying to engage people with a similar experience. It can make it easier to build trust and develop those relationships. So having a person or several people or a whole team of people with the lived experience can be a great strategy for improving this work. But as with any worker, peer providers need support to do this work, and programs should have supports built in for this if they're going to use peer providers to do this type of work. Effective referral and linkages. So obviously, a huge part of this job is providing referrals and making linkages for people. Helping staff develop relationships with good contacts and getting staff up to speed on who these contacts are is an important piece of this work. In one of my old jobs, all of the staff were keeping their own independent lists of the best pharmacies and the best housing providers and doctors and day programs, et cetera, et cetera. And then one day someone put together a big binder of their contacts and asked the rest of us to contribute our contacts. And we were all working off the same list. And it was like, why didn't anyone think of coordinating this sooner? So we were all coming together and using each other's contacts, and that's something I think that really helps to improve these programs. Best practices of trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, CTI are of course really useful to this work. So where time and resources permit, providers can really benefit from formal trainings on these approaches. Motivational interviewing helps providers walk people through the stages of change to change harmful behaviors. Training in trauma-informed care can help providers understand, recognize, and respond to the effects of different types of trauma when they're doing outreach and engagement. And this is incredibly important in work with this particular population, as this group has extremely high rates of trauma in comparison to the general population. In addition to best practices, training on conflict de-escalation and personal safety can be really helpful. If you're sending staff into rough areas to work with people who are in psychiatric crisis or who are using drugs that can make them combative and unpredictable, then hopefully you are supporting them with trainings on conflict de-escalation and how to protect themselves in these environments. And basic medical care. So a lot of outreach workers are now carrying Narcan or other opioid antagonists and getting trained up on this. Chances are that in this work you're going to come across plenty of health-related issues, and just giving providers a basic grasp of what to look for in case of a heart attack, stroke, diabetic reaction, for example, can not only make people feel more secure in doing this work, but it also might save a life. And of course, self-care, 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 self-care. To make these efforts most effective, you want to create an environment that supports and encourages self-care, so not just telling people to go take a bubble bath, but really making a supportive environment, reminding people to take a real lunch break, really setting up good vacation policies. This is genuine structure of an organization that supports self-care. It'll prevent turnover and help staff do their best work in the long run. And what can policymakers and local leaders do to improve outreach and engagement? So they can incorporate these programs into their plans to end homelessness and make sure that homelessness service providers are teaming up with non-traditional partners such as law enforcement, jails, prisons, hospitals, other healthcare providers to help outreach staff identify and target individuals who may be experiencing or at risk of homelessness and to connect them with the housing and services that they need. They can make sure that the COC has high quality and complete data at the individual level, which will allow communities and programs to better monitor their progress and hold themselves accountable to identifying and quickly helping people who enter the system. They can resolve funding issues for outreach programs and get Medicaid to pay for these services by adding outreach and engagement to state Medicaid waivers. Outreach and engagement activities can be really challenging to fund, in part due to an unclear understanding among funders of what outreach services really entail. So the role of outreach needs to be better promoted. Programs should be given better guidance from states and localities on how to utilize federal resources for these activities. Communities can also work to develop other funding streams for outreach and engagement. As we all know, the fallout of homelessness can end up costing communities a lot more money in the long run than just paying for housing in the first place. Jail costs a lot, inpatient hospitalizations, emergency room visits all cost a lot. So finding ways to redirect these resources to prevention strategies like outreach is key. Last but not least, policymakers and leaders can work to build institutional outreach or in-reach into programs for relevant populations. So we know that people leaving jail are at very high risk of homelessness, so it would make logical sense then to build an in-reach program into the jail discharge process by incorporating in-reach programs into corrections, healthcare, and behavioral health systems. Communities can ultimately save outreach workers a lot of hassle in locating and linking people with housing later on, and this makes for a more effective and efficient service system overall. So I'm going to leave it there and pass the mic over to Amanda, who's going to go into a little bit more depth on this and give some case examples from her work as a nurse doing outreach. But first, I want to thank Samantha for the opportunity to make this presentation. And if anyone's interested in learning more about outreach and engagement, I'm just leaving a few resources that may be of use to you. So, Amanda, all you.
Thank you so much, Emmy. I think my examples are going to complement all of the information that you've shared really well. Thank you so much for all the information. So I spent 2.5 years as a street nurse in Sacramento, California, both on the streets and also in the camps. And our camps tend to be on the borders of the city, around the river, and in wooded areas. I think, so these are kind of the areas that I'm going to cover. These concepts, I think, are extremely important when doing outreach and engagement and developing a relationship. And a lot of it has to do with the attitude in which you approach. So I like to say meeting your neighbors, because there's really a breakdown in community, and most of everybody who is unhoused feels ostracized from society. And part of changing that culturally, I think, is simply in changing our mindset. And we need to meet our neighbors, because that's who they are. They may not be living next door in a home or an apartment, but they are part of our community. Respect. Respect is huge in both outreach and engagement, especially when you're making your first impression outreaching. You need to really, really respect people's homes and their space. So their tent, their little corner, maybe their little spot under the bridge, effectively, that becomes their home. So ask if you can enter when you approach. Is it okay if you walk down the embankment into their camp? Announce yourself so you're not surprising anybody who may be doing something they don't want you to see, maybe using drugs or maybe something else. But ask permission to enter, and always enter in a humble manner. I'm not a fan of outreach in large groups. I tend to feel that groups of anywhere from 1 to 4 people are best. I prefer even smaller, maybe just 2 people at a time. Otherwise, I think it can feel like an invasion, or people feel like they're in a zoo, and really what you want to do is treat people like individuals with respect. Always enter with a receptive attitude. What can you learn from the people that you're working with? Every single encampment is going to have its own rules, its own social structure. Everyone's story is different. Most of them are filled with a lot of trauma. But definitely enter with a receptive attitude, and you'll be received positively. This has been mentioned so many times throughout the presentations, that don't make promises you cannot keep. I think in my experience, there have been a lot of promises from programs in the Sacramento area that we can get you housing. We can get you housing. We're a housing program. But the fact remains that our housing resources in Sacramento are extremely limited. And be specific about what you're offering. So when some people hear housing is going to be offered, they're assuming that they're going to have their own apartment. But the reality of what's available may be a shared bedroom in a house with 6 other people. And for a lot of our folks with trauma, with different types of mental illness they're suffering from, that's not a realistic environment for them. And it's not something that they're going to be readily able to accept or function in. And so make sure that you're very clear with what you're offering, and that will just help. Number one, it's going to help your relationship with that person, but in addition to your relationship, it's going to help their overall experience with the provider community. Bring gifts. And when I say gifts, I mean really useful, simple things that people can use. It might be coffee, it might be water, maybe toothbrush and toothpaste, maybe some Band-Aids, maybe hand sanitizer, things like that. Just bring something to offer, especially when you're just doing outreach and you don't have a relationship yet. It also, I think, bringing items that are useful is also just a good excuse to go and talk to people if you're doing kind of just cold outreach. Initially, when you're outreaching to people, in my opinion, it's best not to require people to show their IDs. I know that some programs are going to want you to track your they're going to want you to track your engagement, track your outreach. And so oftentimes real names, social security numbers, date of birth, and things are required. But I think that can be a real turnoff to people. And so if the program that you're working in allows that flexibility to not require those things, that's great. I'm a big fan of not bringing in authority figures, and absolutely not media without permission. People do not want to be treated like they're in a zoo, like they're something. They want to be treated like individuals and respected. They really don't want to be treated as the next news story. There are many programs that do utilize police officers, and I don't want to speak negatively about them because I don't know how that particular program works. But in my experience, people do not want to have people have negative experiences with police, not just because if they're running from something, but you guys who are out there, you know very well that people are moved on from safe space to safe space, from camp to camp, and often not respected, and their survival gear is often taken. Outreach and engagement can take a lot of time. And if your program allows you the flexibility to actually take time engaging and outreaching with people, And he mentioned something about not every interaction is going to be really goal-oriented. Not every interaction is going to be a formal assessment or working on something specific. But a lot of times it's going to be about just sitting and listening to that person. What do they have to talk about that day? Just developing the relationship. I think in order to manage realistic expectations, something to think about is that in your interactions with people, you may just be planting seeds. And I have an example of that. There was a gentleman named Greg. He's a gentleman that I met in a park one day during outreach. He was in his 60s, abusing alcohol. He had severe anxiety. He was a gentleman who did want housing. He had a lot of medical issues, emphysema, probably some cardiac issues. And he did have, in the past, a severe leg injury, and he had some metal hardware in that leg. And that leg would quickly and easily and frequently become infected. And so, of course, if I'm thinking from the provider's standpoint, my goal would be, let's get this gentleman connected with a primary care physician. And, you know, he really wasn't interested in that. So what we would do when I would see him is we would sit on a park bench and we would talk. Sometimes I would sit there with him and we wouldn't talk. We would just sit there. And he really didn't want anything that I was offering at the time. Or so I thought. Maybe 6 months later, I was out in a different park, and a gentleman came up to me and asked if I was Amanda, and he said that Greg was looking for me. He was in the alley behind a pizza shop, and he couldn't leave because something was wrong with his leg, and he really wanted me to come look for his leg. So I went, and what I discovered was an extremely swollen, red, very infected leg with open wounds. And, of course, he really needed to go to a doctor. He really needed some antibiotics. And he wasn't willing to do any of that at that moment. And in my program, I didn't have a prescriber with me, and he didn't want me to take him to the emergency room. He didn't want to go himself. He just wanted to wait. And I can provide the support and education to him, but of course I can't make him do something that he's not willing to do. So I would just come back and visit him, check his vital signs, make sure he's not, hopefully not going septic or anything like that. One day I showed up and he was really upset, and he'd gone to the emergency room the night before. Was discharged in the middle of the night with a prescription, and it was really difficult for him to get to a pharmacy, let alone walk out of the emergency room with that infected leg. So I ended up picking up his antibiotics for him, which weren't the best. It was in the middle of summer in Sacramento, California, so we're absolutely way in the 90s, sometimes in the hundreds, and he was prescribed liquid antibiotics that require refrigeration. Not exactly sure why that happens, but that's what happens. And end of the story is just sitting with him and talking to him, even though I thought he wasn't interested in anything, allowed me to develop enough of a trusting relationship so that when he did need help, he was able to send somebody to find me. The gentleman ended up being hospitalized because the non-refrigerated antibiotics weren't effective out in the street. And from that hospitalization, I was able to connect him with another program in my organization that was a medical respite shelter. He ended up being housed from there. He lived in permanent supportive housing for 1.5 years. And a lot of times I think that we feel as providers that sometimes what we're doing might not really be helpful, or did we actually help that person? About 1.5 years after my last contact with this gentleman, I received a message from a hospice nurse that this gentleman was in hospice care. He was actively dying, and he wanted to reach out to thank me. And, you know, I see a lot of people, and I felt that I suppose I wasn't aware of how much a simple kindness meant to this gentleman. And so everybody out there, don't, if you feel like you're not making progress, your simple, respectful interactions with people can make a big difference to them. Trust takes time. We already talked about showing up when you say you're going to show up. Your reputation really matters. I think it's extremely important to collaborate with other community service teams and even just community members. I have another story. The gentleman's name was Ron. In his 70s, he'd been homeless in that same area for well over 20 years, and undiagnosed some type of psychotic disorder. He would, when he would talk to me, which was very rare, I think I spent a year just coming by and saying hi and maybe giving him some coffee sometimes before we actually had some type of conversation. But when he did start to talk, it was really clear that he was paranoid and had a lot of thought broadcasting. One thing that I did notice was that he would talk to the groundskeeper at the park. And so one day I decided to talk to the groundskeeper. And the groundskeeper has known this gentleman for many, many years and would sometimes lend him tools because this gentleman liked to make makeshift musical instruments. And so I would collaborate with the groundskeeper, and I also would collaborate with another service provider in the community who was actually out there and was a peer navigator and would help people get document ready and everything for housing. This gentleman that I'm talking about, my role with him was to help him to address some of his medical issues, which were pretty significant. He often had infected, extremely swollen legs with open wounds. And he would not take medications for them, nor would he let me look at his wounds or wrap them or anything like that. So one day, the person I was working with who was helping people to get housing ready, he wouldn't speak with her either, even though she had done the same type of outreach that I had with him month after month after month. It ended up that the groundskeeper at the park where this gentleman hung out was our key. This guy had known him for many years. He trusted him. And it ended up being that groundskeeper who allowed us to actually help this man. The groundskeeper vouched for us, spoke with the gentleman, spoke with Ron, and from that point, Ron would allow me to do his wound care. He certainly was not interested in getting any mental health help at that point, and maybe he never will, but he was able to get an ID, and the person who I was talking about that would help that people become document ready for housing was able to get him an income. And so then he was still on the street, but he was able to live a little bit more comfortably, and he'd had a positive experience with service providers. As I just mentioned, I think collaboration with other community resources and other community members is so, so important. Sometimes I think it's really important because people often have very negative experience with healthcare providers, and so they're very mistrusting of us. In the past, I think we've tended to try to tell people what to do, and when they're accessing care in hospitals and maybe even in doctor's offices, unfortunately, the medical community is not always very educated in motivational interviewing, in mental illness and substance abuse, and so there tends to still be a lot of negative interactions, judgment, and paternalism. However, if you look at your local grassroots resources, these are examples of some that are in Sacramento. They tend to outreach without and offer help without requiring anything in return from that person. They offer unconditional support. For example, we have a group called Mercy Peddlers, and they have well over 40 people who ride around on bicycles in Sacramento, and they just talk to people. They offer them water, they offer them coffee. They're basically out there saying, you matter. You're not just an outcast, and we're someone in the community. We're basic community members, and we care about you. And they're not requiring anything from those people. And therefore, they're trusted. And so they know these people. And so if you're looking for referrals, or if you're looking for people in particular, these grassroots people who already have a very good relationship established may be able to help you find the person you're looking for, or may help you to establish that relationship with them. If you have a local harm reduction services organization where you are, ours, for example, does a lot of needle exchange. They go out into the camps. They do needle exchange. They offer a lot of other services in addition to that, certain types of health screenings. But the point is, they meet people out where they are, again, like Emmy said, literatively and figuratively. And a lot of them, at least in the Sacramento area, have already lived out there. They've already been homeless. They've already been, they've already dealt with or are still dealing with substance abuse issues. And therefore, they're very trusted, and so they can also help you to find people and help you establish trust in a relationship. And they may also, if you're not sure about something, they may also be able to offer you tips as far as relationship development goes. Sometimes you need to find your in, and what is that in going to be? Sometimes it's someone else from the homeless community, and once you've established your relationship and you have a positive reputation, those people can help you. Oftentimes in the camps, in the community, there's people that I guess I like to call shot callers. And so they're a respected person, a powerful person, almost like an elder out in the community, in the camps. And if you have their respect, the rest of that community is also more likely to respect you and help you integrate as part of the community. For example, there is a community in Sacramento that historically has been very isolated, even from the rest of the homeless community. They live in a particular area of Sacramento that's called the Island, and I guess the reputation is that these are people who are difficult to engage and people who don't want help. Well, somebody who used to live in that community, I connected with, and she actually just goes out and still meets with people that she calls her homeless family. And she helped me get in touch with a gentleman who's called Scary. Scary had just been in the hospital. That's where I met him. He'd had a stroke. He was unable to express himself verbally anymore. He had a lot of medical issues, but he absolutely did not want to go to a shelter. He was going back to the island to live in his tent. And how he was going to manage that with his illnesses was quite a mystery. And so I did what I could to help support him with that. But he was a shot caller. He was a very respected gentleman who lived on the island for many, many years, and the community out there respected him. And so once the community was able to see that I cared about him, that I was treating him with respect, that I was helping him, it really opened up that entire island community to me, at least for planting seeds for someone having positive engagement with a healthcare provider, which can be a really big deal. Some barriers for us to provide help, I think, are entering with the wrong attitude. Emmy was mentioning the importance of education, trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing techniques. And I think not just motivational interviewing techniques, but also the spirit of it. That you're there as, you're not there to tell somebody what to do, that change takes a long time. Change can be extremely incremental, and small victories are important. And if we enter with those attitudes and that we are a partner, we're going to help these people as a partner, not necessarily as a provider. It can go a long way with developing good relationships. I see that rigid programs can cause a lot of problems. Programs that really require a lot of numbers for proving how many people you're talking to, how many people you're outreaching to, how many people you're getting housing. Stats are very important, of course, to see how productive we're being and how useful we're being, and they can lead us to altering our, maybe altering the way we work with people or altering some of our policies. But when we stick with really rigid programs, I think that it eliminates a large population from being able to receive help. And being out in the field is, you just can't adhere to a rigid expectation or a rigid process, because it's not rigid out there, and things change very quickly. They can change really dramatically, and you need to have flexibility in programs in order to be able to help people. And I think we, all of us as providers, we really want to be able to help. And it's frustrating sometimes, and it leads to burnout when we're not able to help. And so I think that if we reestablish what our expectations are, and as Emmy said, celebrate the really small victories, that can help us a lot, as not being disappointed and not experiencing as much burnout. Overall, relax. When you go out there, these are just people, and we're also just people. I like to promote kind of the spirit of mutuality, in that not only are we out there trying to help people and trying to teach people, but there is just an enormous amount of information that we can learn from the people that we're helping. We can learn about adaptation, we can learn about perseverance, we can learn about the human spirit. It's really incredible, some of the stories that people have to tell, and I think it's okay to recognize that we also get something back from them. And not only that, I think it's really important to recognize that, because if we don't, then we tend to feel that what we're doing isn't helpful, and we're only focused on the goals of the program or the goals of the provider. Establish boundaries and also honor boundaries. Boundaries out in the field are not quite the same as they are when you're in an institution. It's absolutely less formal. And boundaries, of course, not having sexual relationships with people are extremely important. Not having people call you at all hours of the night, those types of things are extremely important. They need to know that you're out there to help. But the boundaries will be a little bit more relaxed, and I think that they are, Emmy had mentioned that it's really important for supervisors and managers to be talking about those boundaries. There are just so many situations that happen out in the field and the relationships that are created, that I think a constant conversation about the individual situations and how to deal with boundaries in that particular situation are really important because they change. It's not cut and dry. It's not black and white like when you're in an institution or in a controlled environment. I guess another thing I think that's important if your program allows it is to kind of go with the flow. Things have to end up happening really organically. There was a gentleman named Daniel who I was very familiar with out in the field. He had a lot of medical issues, some substance abuse issues, and I would encounter him once in a while. One day I got a call from someone I've never met. He called himself Killer, and he was calling to ask for help, and he said, I need help. I don't know what to do. I found your card in my friend Daniel's wallet. We're at the hotel, and he won't wake up. And so I assessed the situation a little bit. Was this a 911 call that I needed to make? Was it something that I could go assess? The issue was that I couldn't tell Daniel to call the police because Daniel was absolutely never going to call the police. He was never going to call an ambulance. He was never going to call 911 for a number of reasons. Number one, he was involved in a lot of illegal activity. Number two, he referred to Killer as his elder. Killer referred to Daniel as his elder. And he did not have permission from his elder to get him help, and so he would not contact anyone formal. He would not contact an authority figure. And so the options were to call 911 or to head over to the motel to see what was going on. From the information that Killer gave me, it didn't seem like a 911 call at that moment. But the flexibility in the program allowed me to go over there, assess the situation, physically assess the gentleman, and then also alleviate the responsibility from Killer because he was not able to do that according to their social structure. And in the future, I ended up getting really good, legitimate referrals from Killer to help other gentlemen. So being able to go with the flow in that situation was really useful. Thank you so much, everybody, for calling me back to do more work with you guys and share some of my experiences. From all the comments I'm seeing in the public chat, it seems like I'm preaching to the choir. So hopefully I was able to give you guys some information or some tips that will be useful, but it sounds like everyone out there is kind of in the same boat. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Emmy. This is Sherry. I am back to moderate. This was wonderful information. Kristen, I am experiencing some odd noise. Are we okay?
We are. I'm not sure where that was coming from, but it seems to have resolved.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. So we've got some great questions and some discussion points. I wanted to pull in something that one of you shared in the chat box in the public chat. So hold on one second.
I think we may have lost Sherry's audio, so while we wait for her to reconnect, I'm going to throw out a question. This is not the thing that Sherry was just going to share, but here's a question that came in during Emmy's presentation. It says, our program offers many resources. I'd like to learn how to engage clients after we've helped them achieve housing because the mental health or substance use issues still remain a factor. After they're housed, sometimes it's difficult to keep them engaged unless they see an immediate benefit such as finding funding, providing transportation, et cetera. So I'm going to throw that out. I'm not sure which of you wants to tackle that, but what do you think? How do you continue the relationship after they've been housed?
I can give my 2 cents, and then I'd be interested to hear what Amanda thinks. But, I mean, first I would say, you know, is this a problem for the person, and if it's not impacting their overall functioning, you know, is it our goal, is it their goal, and if it's really not impairing them, just like, you know, their autonomy should be honored. If it's really impairing and, you know, you want to work with the person on engaging them around change in those behaviors, and I think using motivational interviewing strategies of talking through cost-benefit analysis and decisional balances about what's working for them, about not changing, and you know, how things would be different if they did change, and helping them think through, you know, whether or not to engage in mental health substance use treatment is a good approach. But maybe Amanda has some other thoughts on that.
No, I agree. I think is their goal, or is your goal their goal? Are those goals in alignment? And how impactful is the mental health or substance abuse issue that they're experiencing? Is it putting them at risk of losing their housing? But I think another thing, it just points to the importance of the relationship that had been developed. If that person, since we are helpers and they may feel like they don't really need any more help, of course that's going to be a factor. But if that relationship is still there, they, chances are, if they're ready for help or they feel it's time for help, they will still engage if that relationship is established.
Yeah, and I think James is bringing up a good point in the public chat about housing case management. So if you're doing a warm handoff, if you are no longer the primary service provider, you know, helping work with them and give them whatever support they need, or, you know, letting them take it from there is good.
Awesome, thank you. We've got Sherry back. I need to bump her back up, so you're going to hear a system announcement, and then she'll be back with us. Hang on for 1 second.
A co-moderator has joined the conference.
Okay, Sherry,
Hi, everyone.
Can I just get a quick sound check? There you are. All
yes.
right, awesome.
Yay. I apologize. This is the worst possible time for the phone to boot me off, but there it is. I apologize. One thing that I was saying to myself before I realized that I had been booted off was Myra Kodner, I hope I said your name right, Myra, said something that I think is really important for this discussion. And she said that you sometimes tell people, tell me what you want. But sadly, a lot of people had horrendous childhoods and weren't taught to have dreams or never had the opportunity to dream. And then you said, poet Langston Hughes wrote, without dreams, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. And I love that. But I think it's an important prelude to a question. The people we're dealing with are dealing with multiple layers of trauma, and homelessness itself is traumatic, backgrounds of trauma coming all the way from childhood and from life on the streets, coupled with serious mental illness and co-occurring disorders or substance use disorders, maybe, you know, backgrounds with corrections, and there's a whole list of things that people are dealing with. So I guess the question I would like Emmy and Amanda to answer for us is, how do you begin, building a relationship in spite of the multiple layers of trauma on someone? And can you measure the effects of trauma? What would you say to that?
Amanda, do you want to take it? No.
Yeah, sure. This is, just in my experience, I found that people really wanted to trust. They wanted to be able to develop that relationship despite their really negative experiences. And that trauma and the negative experiences definitely prevent people from wanting to engage and prevent them from wanting to seek services, maybe mental health services, substance abuse services, even housing. It's definitely a barrier, but I think that it's just taking time, and people want to be listened to, and people want to tell their story. And so if you have the time to be able to listen to them and hear what they have to say, it definitely doesn't heal their trauma, but it does open up a space to where they feel more comfortable, to where they may be willing to address some of those issues at some point.
Yeah, and I would just add in there, one of the parts of that question was, can you measure trauma? And you can quantify it. There's measures like the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs measure that somebody mentioned in the public chat. And when in our studies of folks, we see kind of compounded trauma over time, not just in childhood, but in adult experiences over time too. But yeah, I would absolutely echo what Amanda said, and just leaving space and through the journey of getting people's immediate needs, their concrete basic needs met, like having a roof over their head, having food, all the things that you need to kind of build up to larger goals and dreams, I think always helps too.
Oh, thank you. If there was one thing that you would tell your younger self as you were beginning this kind of work, what would that be, Amanda, and what would that be, Emmy?
Oh, man.
Yeah, I know.
That's deep. That's a deep one.
Okay, well, that's a hard one. And I would answer
as,
kindness. I mean, I would be kind. I mean, and I think that a lot of that comes through in what you both have been saying about outreach and engagement. So I guess, what would have been helpful for you to know? And I know we're just about down to 5 minutes, so.
I will say pace yourself. I think that going out of the gate, was just thinking about how important this work was and how much needed to be done. I was really, really pushing and not taking bathroom breaks because, I was rushing from appointment to appointment with people, or dealing with emergencies, and that I think is not a sustainable way to do it. What they say about taking care of yourself is important, because if you're going to do this work long term, you should be taking bathroom breaks and and pacing yourself. So that is something I would remind myself of early on.
Thank you. That's helpful. Amanda, how about you? What do you wish you could tell your younger self?
Definitely what Emmy said. You need to pace yourself, because if you're going to be in it long term, it's stressful. I would say have somebody to talk about the things that you're seeing. Have somebody to talk with who does similar work as you, who is also seeing the same things that you're seeing. Because there's a lot of, you as the provider, you experience a lot of moral distress, and sometimes trauma yourself just from seeing the systemic issues can just be overwhelming. Not even just the systemic barriers that there are. To me, that was much more stressful than actually working with the people who may not be ready to change as fast as I would like them to change. It's kind of those barriers that can make you feel despondent almost. And I think having someone who's experiencing similar things to be able to vent that stuff about and to discuss that kind of thing is really important.
That is super valuable. Thank you. That was so insightful from both of you, and your presentations were spectacular. I would just like to ask the audience to just type in the chat box, what is one thing you'll take away from this session? And we'll use this. We really we'll be looking at the comments and the evaluations that we get from you to plan for TA next year. So what do you want to take away, or what will you take away from the discussion today? I am going to tell you that HHRN, SAMHSA's Homeless and Housing Resource Network, does provide technical assistance and support to federal, state, and local agencies, providers, individuals, families who experience or are at risk of homelessness. Feel free to reach out to us if you have a technical assistance request. I can't promise that we can honor it, but I can promise that it will get full attention and consideration from SAMHSA and from the HHRN staff. These are our fabulous speakers, Emmy Titterington and Amanda Buccina, who touched me today. I love this work. I'm passionate about this work, and I loved the message that you shared with us. So thank you both for that. And with that, I think we're ready to close the presentation. Kristen?